room here at the Guilford Free Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight and to introduce our distinguished panel. I might have called this program Parallel Lives, and I think you will be able to tell why. Carl Balistraci grew up here in Guilford, and after college and serving in the Air Force, he returned in 1964 to stay. He was a teacher and then principal at Adams Middle School. Retirement gave him the opportunity to fully develop his interests in carving duck decoys, researching history. He's published Flesh and Stone, Stony Creek in the Age of Granite, and membership in the Ancient Mariners Fife and Drum Corps. He now serves as our first selectman. Stanley Barnes came to Guilford as a young boy, and he too returned after serving in the Air Force during World War II. Stan taught at 2 of the elementary schools, Calvin Lee and Melissa Jones, before becoming principal of Calvin Lee. Stan also carves in soapstone and has volunteered his time to the library board, to Faulkner's Light Brigade, to the Guilford Community Fund. He's also served several terms as the town's selectman. Edith Nettleton came to Guilford as a young girl. After graduating from the local school, she went to Springfield, Massachusetts to be educated in librarianship. She returned as the town's first paid librarian in 1933 and was the best investment in Guilford's library history. She opened the new building in 1934. For 11 years, Edith bought and cataloged the books, ran the reference and circulation desks, and cared for the building. In 1945, part-time assistants were hired. The first phone was put in 1952. She oversaw the expansion in 1977 and retired in 1978. She was honored in 2003 for 70 years of volunteering. We treasure her continuing service today. Penny Colby began her library career here in 1979. After teaching drama in Guilford schools, she found her niche here in the reference department and ultimately in the historical room. Her retirement a year ago has given her time to indulge in her hobbies of gardening, sewing, and knitting, as well as community service. She's on the board of the Guilford Preservation Alliance. Most importantly, she's returned to the library's historical room as a volunteer and has graciously agreed to moderate tonight's discussion. So, Penny.
Thank you all for coming tonight. We're going to start with Edith, and Edith's going to tell us something about what the library was like when she first arrived here. And then we're going to hear from Carl and Stan, and we're hoping that in the last 15 minutes we will have questions from the audience, so be thinking. Edith, can you tell us about the library?
When I was thinking about the library history, it surprised me to realize that we are celebrating this month the 73rd anniversary of the building in which we started. On 23rd of January 1934 was held an open house to introduce the townspeople to their new Guilford Free Library. Can you hear me? Am I talking right?
Maybe hold that.
Many interesting records trace the history of libraries in Guilford. In the 1700s, we were part of a town library, 4 town libraries, Saybrook, Killingworth, and Lyme. In the 1800s, several small library ventures came and went. These had been all subscription libraries, and for which a fee was paid to participate. In 1870, Mr. Simeon Chittenden offered funds for a library to the town, but he had a stipulation that it should be built on the green. This did not meet with town approval. In 1890, the Young Women's Christian Temperance Union had a branch in town, and with a group of young ladies from the First Church, they joined together, opening a free reading room upstairs over Mr. Hale's store, which is now 25 Whitfield Street. This came to be called the Guilford Library Association and was run by 25 ladies. The next year, a gift from Mr. Dickey, who lived in where the Catholic Church is now, gave a gift of a lot on Whitfield Street opposite the Eagle Hose Company, and also $1,000. And this windfall decided the ladies that they should build a library on the lot, and then to earn funds to operate the building for many years, they sponsored and put on entertainments and sales, ice cream socials, and occasionally solicited funds from the town. In 1900, a new member of the group was Miss Martha Cornell. And when she told me years later that she could hardly wait until she was 16 years old and could be elected to the group. Soon she was the president, and with a few others, Miss Lena Shelley among them, they were the librarians for the library and gave many years of service in that way. And both of them continued their interest into the new library when it was built. By 1926, the 25-member Ladies Association and the town realized that things had changed and grown, and they realized that changes were needed, and the association was reorganized, much as we have it today. And also a need for a new building was recognized. The town had received in 1918 a sum of $15,000, a bequest from Miss Clara Sage, which was to be used for a free public library if one had not already been built. This was waiting in the bank when in 1933, Mr. Frederick Spencer made a gift to the town of its corner lot, and it was suitable for a library. So at that time, the town agreed that this was the time to build that new building, and they did so for less than $30,000, which included the furnishings. And what was left over started the endowment fund, which was I guess still goes today somewhat. When I came to work, a month before the opening of this new building, my first task was to review the collection in the old building and get it ready for moving. Miss Cornell, Miss Shelley, and Mrs. Isabel Hubbard, who was the retiring librarian, were invaluable assistants. Both Miss Shelley and Miss Cornell continued their help to me in the new building. When she died, the Shoreline Times said Miss Nat Cornell and the Guilford Library are practically synonymous. She had given almost 50 years of service to the town. In the new library reorganization, committees were assigned, and with the space to do it, many fine exhibits and programs were put on. Books were chosen by a book committee of citizens. Miss Shelley helped out with a preschool story hour. Limited funds, of course, were a challenge. This popular title or that needed book for nonfiction, which should be purchased. For 6 years, the lower floor was used by the school system for the first kindergarten, and that went on until Lee opened in 1950. With an expanded service, business increased, more hours were needed, and part-time assistants were hired. Marjorie Benton Spaulding, Dorothea Bishop, and Miriam Burton, who later became full-time, were some of those who would be full-time. By 1960, crowded shelves caused reorganization, putting the main stack room downstairs in what is now the workroom. Jean Baldwin became the full-time assistant librarian, a happy occurrence for the library and for me. In 1970, again, we needed room. And after much study, a new building was proposed, but rejected by town meeting. To give us a little breathing space, at that time, the children's library was moved into the Lathrop House. That was in 1971. Finally, an addition for this building was voted and erected and opened in 1977. The children's library returned to their new location, and guess who was their librarian? Our Sandy Ruoff, who is celebrating her 30 years with us this month, and is planning for our new addition. The old library on Whitfield Street was given to the town, and they gave it to the Boy Scouts, and it served them until Hurricane Gloria came along and put a branch through the roof, and it had to be demolished. The first book sale that I saw on record was in 1955, and we were so happy to have earned some money. They came to work the next day, and the money was gone. So they had another sale at Fair Day after that, and to try and replace some of that money. And the Friends started the Friends of the Library started in 1973, and they are still giving nice things and doing nice things to create and promote the library work. The board of directors, I've always was so proud of my board of directors. They were very helpful and encouraging about the things that went on during the years, and that was a great joy to have that type of informative coordination with them. Well, I think that's enough for that, and then I can answer any questions that people might have about it.
How much did you spend a year on books in the beginning?
In the very beginning, we had this book committee of citizens who met once a month or so, and I looked it up. In 1 year, we bought about 100 books. And another year, I saw that the book fund was $161 for a year. Yeah, they didn't buy too many books, even with the prices they were then.
How about the McNaughton books that they used to get?
Well, when we had a little more money to use, there was the McNaughton books, which came. They were new fiction mostly. We could order a certain number to come every month, and then we'd send back the one they had them a certain length of time. We'd return them. That got
Instead of buying them.
Instead of buying them, yeah. But you had to have the money to initiate it. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for you. When was it okay to wear slacks to work?
1970?
Oh, no.
I know you couldn't wear slacks to Yukon unless it was 32 or below 0 degrees if you were a female. When I went there in 1958. That was the law at Guilford, at the University of Connecticut.
I think we had teachers at Calvin in the 60s.
Oh, well, you were very progressive. Penny, can we talk a little bit about the schools? And
Yeah.
I'd like to, because this could be lives in parallel, talk a little bit about the school system, because I know a little bit about what Edith went through, going through the Guilford school system, and then 30-some years later, what I went through, and it's totally different from today. Edith's was totally different from me, but I know, Edith, you started up in Clabber Hill, going to school about 100 yards from where you live today. You want to just talk about your school career? And
When I remember starting school there, and at that time, I'm sure there were 8 grades. And there must have been about 2 people and 3 people in each grade.
Now, this, you have to explain. This was in the Clabber Hill single-room schoolhouse,
Right.
and there were how many schools around town like that? There was Leeds Island,
And North Guilford.
North Guilford,
Nut
Clabber
Plains.
Hill, Nut Plains.
Not Plains.
Yeah, but you go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt, but you went through the Clabber Hill School.
Yeah, we had an hour home for lunch, and we mostly went home for lunch, go back again. And thus, at about that time, the upper part of the Institute building, where the high school was reorganized for the 7th and 8th grades, so that there were only 6 grades after the first year or 2 that I was there. And then we went to, we didn't have buses, we
No,
walked
we didn't.
downtown
No.
to go to high school. And we could go on the trolley if you got down to foot the hill in time to catch it, you know. And I think for students, there was a special trolley rate, like 3 cents riding.
And you graduated what year?
I graduated from high school in 1926.
And graduation was where?
Oh, in the town hall.
In the town hall.
In the big room in the town hall.
You have to explain about the town hall in those days because it's totally different from what it is today. Yeah.
Yes, it was built in 1894 or something like that. And the center of it was a big room, and that was where all the town meetings were held. They played basketball in there. It was used for a regular community room. So, yes, they were quite exciting sometimes. And then it was, of course, after it was remodeled, the meetings had to be held somewhere else.
Let me just tell them. In 1945, when I started in the Guilford school system, I went to kindergarten here in the Guilford library in the basement. My class was divided into 2 sections. Half of it went to kindergarten in the back basement of the town hall, and my half went to school here in the basement of the library. And my mother used to love to tell a story that I refused to go to kindergarten unless she bought me a uniform, so they found a little short pants outfit that was red, white, and blue because I wanted to join the Army then. But anyway, I came to school. Mrs. Muriel Mueller was my teacher. And then from kindergarten, we went over to the Church Street School where the Guilford Community Center is now. And I had some great teachers there, but the one I always remember was the teacher principal, Mrs. Potter. When she yelled at a kid in the office, and she only went in the office when she had to yell to a kid or do some administration, but the rest of the time she taught, I think 2nd grade or whatever, you could hear her all over the building. And by the time I got into her class, I was so darn scared of her that I got 100 on every spelling test that year. It was the only year I ever did because I was so frightened of her. But anyway, then we went over to, for a year, Stanley, before your school was built, Calvin Lee, we went over to Boston Street School, across from Page's Insurance now, and now it's a condominium. My wife and I had the opportunity to go there after the first of the year to a party, and I actually got to go upstairs to what's now a bedroom, but it was my classroom then. Mrs. Griffin was my teacher, and I learned to read in that room, but we were there for a year. And I remember that year that Don Cunningham came to town, Stanley, and he started a band. And it didn't matter what age you were, if you played an instrument, you were in the band. And I forget what, I started playing the drums at 9, but we had the rehearsals in the boiler room down in the basement. And the boiler room, it was like an upside down spider with the tubes going all over the place. And the only place that, I can't remember his first name, but this big tall guy from the high school named Johnson, Ron Johnson, maybe, anyway, he played the tuba, and there was only one place in between these pipes that he could fit the tuba. But the drum section sat on top of the carpenter's bench, and Mr. Mueller, Mullen was the custodian, and Freddie Mullen, and he wanted to come teach us how to play paradiddles in the middle of rehearsal. But anyway, we started there, and I think today, my God, if there was an OSHA back then, the whole town would have been shut down. But anyway, we went down to Calvin Lee, which was Engelman's Field, to watch Mr. Cox and Mr. Richmond Curtis dig the first shovel of soil out for the Calvin Lee School. And then a year or two later, a year and a half later maybe, we moved in to Calvin Lee, and that was memorable because we had in the whole school of Calvin Lee, we actually had 3 male teachers. But Mrs. Hubbard was our first principal, the principal before Stanley, and we were all scared to death of her. I remember one day when Mr. Cull's pants ripped in recess, we were playing football, he had to go home and change his clothes, and Mrs. Hubbard came in to read us poetry, and you could have heard a pin drop the whole time because we were all pretty frightened of her too. But then we spent 7 years up at what's now the Adams School. That was the junior high and then the high school. And again, if you played an instrument, you were in a band. It didn't matter what age you were. So I had like 7 letters in band because I could play the drums and I was in the band. But and we graduated the class of 58. And it was really kind of fun for me because after teaching at Adams and then going around to the high school and then Baldwin, I ended up coming back to Adams as principal, so I ended my career there. It was kind of closing the circle. But Stanley, why don't you talk about your career in the Guilford school system?
Here, and it sounds better, does it? On your chest?
We can hear your heart
here. If it stops, let me know. Carol remembers going to Calvin Lee in about 1950. And the nicest part about most of the people of his generation is that every one of them I've met has always told me he was the first one to enter the school. I don't know how all these kids got in at the same time. But it was very clear that they wanted to get out of what they were in, which was Church Street School. Now, Carl mentioned Mrs. Potter, and at Mrs. Potter's retirement party some 50 years ago, we had a party, I think it was in one of the school auditoriums, and the nicest part about it was that Richard Chapman, who came back, survived the Bataan Death March, came back to Guilford, a little kooky, but nonetheless right with it, and he had Mrs. Potter, of course. And when Mrs. Potter stood up and accepted a gift that somebody gave her, she said, "I'm speechless." And up in front, up jumped, guess who? Richard Chapman. And in a nice loud voice he said, "I've known Mrs. Potter, and if she says she's speechless, it's time for her to retire." This was Guilford humor of that period. But Carl didn't mention Mrs. Hubbard very much, because Mrs. Hubbard was a regal lady. You walked in and Mrs. Hubbard stood erect, icy, spoke with that Maine accent that said, "I am not from Guilford, I am from up country." And nobody ever questioned Mrs. Hubbard, excepting that the men teachers, of which I was one, we got away with murder with her because we were her boys. And the nicest part about the whole thing was that somewhere along the line, she had said, when she got ill towards 1960, I guess, she said she wanted her boys to be her bearers.
Oh.
And it was a nice thing. So guess who? Joe Dolan, who went to North Guilford, Stanley Barnes, Jim Rook, and of all things, who?
Alcohol.
No, geez, no, not Al. These were all her boys, and we bore her to her grave. I think Joe Dolan, Jr. and Sr., we got stories about the Dolan boys. Fish Dolan and Hooks Dolan. Fish Dolan worked down on the docks, and Hooks Dolan went to North Guilford, among other schools. So we had, the school business was very different then, and you mentioned 3 men teachers. I'm thinking of the 3 of them, but one of them was Joel Davis. And Joel Davis was a tough farm boy. And these boys got to him. And I remember one day he said to me, Stanley, I don't know if I'm cut out to be a teacher. I said, well, stick with it and you may make it. Well, he turned out to be not only a pretty good teacher, but he was a good administrator up in Southington and Durham. So he had to leave Guilford. And that, like so many things.
Let me read a thing from Red White.
When we talk about characters and icons of Guilford, one of my favorite all-time people and friends was a man named Rudd White. He and his brother Sid owned and ran White House Florists, which is still in existence today, but not with the color and the character that it was all the years of my growing up. When Rudd passed away, I wrote this, and I could probably read it and do it a lot faster than if I spoke about him, but I want to read one little tidbit that he gave me about his school days in Guilford. But first, in the mid-1950s, when I first met Rudd White, he had already lived enough of life's experiences to fill the shoes of several men. As the years passed and I got to know him better, it became evident that this individual was one of the most interesting human beings that I would ever know. After years of friendship, I asked Rudd if I could interview him on tape. I wanted to hear about the Guilford of his youth. Rudd possessed a bardic quality in his storytelling, but so seldom talked about himself. With a twinkle in his eye, he could mimic a Yankee twang and turn a trip to the outhouse into an uproarious adventure. One of the stories that he told was about going to Guilford, and I think he was class of 22, so he's a little bit ahead of you, but he told a story to me. He lived down in Leeds Island. He said all of the Leeds Island kids, 25 in all, attended school in one-room school building, which is now a home just north of the rail line on Moose Hill Road. Rudd recalled Leeds Island was a community of Leeds, but as the quarry industry developed, immigrants moved in. And first the Swedes, then the Irish, and finally a small influx of Italians. Or Stanley would say Italians. Leeds Island became a very busy place. Our railroad station was 3 times the size of the Guilford station. We had our own post office and a general store. There was no Catholic church in Stony Creek at the time, but a sizable church was built in the meadow by the trolley line on Leeds Island, and many of the quarry folk attended. I shared with Rudd that one of my uncles, although born in Stony Creek, there's a picture of the Leeds Island Schoolhouse, was baptized in that church, and his birth was registered with the town clerk in Guilford. One of Rudd's fondest memories was the armistice of 1918. Quote, us young'uns were caught up in the excitement of it all. We had attended bond drives, ridden on floats, and sang patriotic songs for so long. At the news, some of the quarry workers made an effigy of the Kaiser and blew it up with a half stick of dynamite. It was a great moment for us all. Rudd's favorite story about this daily routine of going to school took place during a bitterly cold 8-week winter spell. There was deep snow. And after the road had been, this is 146 now from Leeds Island, had been made smooth and icy by teams of oxen. The youngsters could travel by sleigh to school. Ed Lee would drive one day and I the next, Rudd said. We were the two oldest. On this one particular day, I was driving, and as was often the case, I had to stop at Rolf's Feed and Grain on Water Street. Now, during the day when they came to school, they would tie the horses over behind the Congregational Church. There was a long shed there where on Sundays people would come to church services and sleighs and whatnot, or wagons during the summer, tie the horses there. And the kids did the same thing during the school day. Today this building is a flower shop, the grain shop on Water Street. We had to load 3 bags of grain for our animals. Our sleigh was a cutter. 3 of us sat in the front, Dick Dolan, Bernice Leet, and myself. Ed Leet and Eleanor Norton sat on the grain bags in the back. Ed was really sweet on Eleanor at the time. Well, when we finally had everything loaded and everyone in place, I yelled, "Giddy up!" And the horse, who had been standing in sub-zero temperatures all day, bolted like a streak of lightning. Ed went end over end off the back of the cutter, and with him chasing us down icy Water Street, it took me pulling with all my strength over a half-mile to stop the animal. Ed came huffing and puffing up, and we all set to laughing until our sides were hurting. Ed jumped up, and we headed home. Everyone was bundled up. We had blankets over our legs. We arrived at Leeds Island. Ed was the first one off. We said our goodbyes. Bernice was next, and then we got to Eleanor's house. As Dick and I turned to say our goodbyes to Eleanor, her face was crimson. She sputtered that she needed help. Well, we learned in an awkward fashion that Eleanor had answered the call of nature in her fit of laughter, and as we continued on our way, her petticoats had frozen to the grain bag. While Dick began to pull on one side and I the other, we were clumsy and rough. There was ripping and tearing, but finally Eleanor was free, and she dashed from the cutter to the house, embarrassed to the core. In those days, of course, we never spoke of such things, but Eleanor visits every few years now from Victoria, Canada, and always regales us with this story. At the time, Rudd was 85 as well as his, or 80 as well as his classmates. But, you know, if we can go back to that time and picture that scene, it could have only happened then.
That was wonderful. Oh, that's marvelous.
I wanted to know what kids did after dinner in the summertime.
You really want to?
I know Edith lived way up in Clavert Hill, so she wasn't anywhere near the green. But did you play games? Did you play?
We were on our neighbors, we played.
Yeah.
We played a lot, yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes in the summertime.
Can't hear.
You got to
We got, one of the things this brings up is that in the early 30s, when I was a boy, there was no such thing as beer in town, because those of you who remember, there was a Volstead Act, enacted in, 1919 and not repealed until 33. There was no beer in town officially, so we didn't do any drinking, we didn't do any, maybe a little bit of hard cider if we could find it. But there was none of that, and there was a very interesting polarization. For instance, my group was at Mulberry Point, Tubbs Point, Mulberry. We used to sit on the seawall there and evaluate all the livestock that went by. It was male and female, mostly female. So we knew them all because they were our sisters. So it was very negative. And then we found out that there was an equal group over there in Leeds Island that met at Sanborn's store. My, those were more exciting than our sisters. So there was a sort of exchange there between the Mulberry Point kids and the Leeds Islanders. But one other thing that we did do on Sundays, surprisingly enough, was have hymn sings. There was a reverend over in Indian Cove, Tejan. Reverend Tejan used to organize these hymn sings, and we'd go over there and sing to our heart's content. So things were wholesome most of the time. most of the time. But the Volstead Act changed things.
You were going to tell us a little about the Little League.
Which?
After World War II, baseball was a very big sport in Guilford. Partly because there was a semi-pro team all along the shoreline, went up to Killingworth, but Old Saybrook, Madison, Clinton, Guilford, probably Westbrook went with some of the town, but Brantford was a strong team and whatnot. In 1949, my father was manager of the Guilford team, and it was a combination of some young guys like Artie and Chick Fonicello and one really young guy, Whit Thompson, and then some other well-known names in Guilford, Howie Jacobson, Don Rood, whose wife owned the fish market out on Boston Street next to the Black House, some Vitalis and Gervasonis, Norm Spencer and whatnot, some old Guilford names and some newer Guilford names, but the team was very good and it won the Shoreline Championship that year. And one of the young men that played on the team, and he was one of the youngest, Whit Thompson, got together with Tom Loomis, and in 1950 they organized the Guilford Little League for the first time. Our playground, our rec center, our everything was the green. And the baseball diamond was on Guilford Green. Home plate was down near Dowden's Drugstore. And center field was about the center of the green. If you hit a home run, it had to be toward the town hall or the Episcopal church. There were no bases. We didn't really have any equipment or uniforms. We just had a mud hole for first base, second base, third base, and home plate. And the backstop was a big maple tree. But Whit and Tom put together some teams. They got some sponsors, and actually I called him because I didn't want to give out any misinformation. But in 1950, Silvio Lupone, who ran a local clothing store downtown, Fred Bennett, who was one of the stalwarts in the fire department, Bill Ghazi, who owned the turkey farm up on Route 1, and August Bukta, who owned one of the oil businesses, they and the Fire Department Association were sponsors. I think they each put up $50 for a team, and we got uniforms, and my class of 58 were just the right age between, we were about 10 years old then, so what ended up being my high school class, the whole class was in the Little League at the time. I was on the Pirates team. We had the Yankees, the Giants, and the Red Sox. And we had the first game in April, and there were 150 parents there, according to the Shoreline Times. It was really a big thing in town at that time, and it was the first organized situation that we had. Leslie I. Dudley came out and threw out the first ball. I think we had 50 players altogether, including the summer kids that came to town. Last year when I threw out the first ball for Little League, we had over 750 kids. We had girls as well as guys playing. We had little munchkins doing stickball as well as Little League. I mean, it's one of the biggest, most successful programs in town today for kids to get started. It was very important for my group because several years later, we got, no, not several, 4 or 5 years later when we got a little older, we had an intermediate team, and we had to play out-of-town teams, Brantford and Saybrook and whatnot, to qualify for the state championships. And I'll never forget, I was not that good an athlete. I was kind of average. But one of my greatest days took place down at Calvin Lee. They had the practice field down and back there then. And at the time, I belonged to the Stony Creek Fife and Drum Corps, and there were a lot of the Brantford kids that belonged to the drum corps with me. We were all friends. And as my coach used to tell me, Valastraci, you have a stance and a swing looks like Babe Ruth, but you couldn't hit a bull in the butt with a broomstick. Anyway, we had 2 on, and I came up to plate, and the coach probably had a difficult decision whether to pull me out and put in a pitch hitter. But lo and behold, the kids from Branford who knew me said, "Oh, this guy's really good, coach." So they walked me. My coach had to take off his hat, hide his face, and turn around. He said, "What are they doing? They're giving us such a gift here." The next guy was Hank Cashin, who was a summer resident, great ball player, went to Brown, played on the varsity and whatnot. So sure enough, they walked me, and Hank Cashin hit a triple, and we won the game. That was one of my greatest moments. But we went on to win the state championship that year, and it was all due to the guys who started us out. Witt and Emilio Mancini, some really great names, Howie Jacobson, people who played on this semi-pro team who then later became our first coaches and brought us through, and that was a great time in Guilford. And to think that we now have almost 800 kids in this league, it's just a great legacy.
I asked Edith the other day if she remembered about cars, when cars first came around, and she had a little story to tell me, and I'd like her to tell you.
Oh my. When I was born in Washington, Connecticut, which is way up in the northwestern corner of the state. And we moved down to Guilford when I was going to be 6 years old. And of course, we had to get from our home up on the hill there down to the station. We packed all of our things up. And to drive us to the station, my uncle said he would take us in his car. That was about, as I say, 1914. And he had not had his car too long, but we had I think that was my first ride in an automobile. It was exciting.
We also think that there might be some interest in trolleys, and if we get into trolleys, there are some maps of where the trolley lines ran. Let's talk about some of the people. Let's talk about Travis.
George Travis. George Travis was about 450 pounds. That was generous. He drove an old LaSalle with one door off, the driver's side, because he couldn't close it. George would meet the train because he was our taxi service. And George would drive you wherever you wanted to go. It was a great service because the trains did stop in Guilford in those days if they had a customer to drop off. Unfortunately, ultimately, George died. Well, if any of you have any experience with caskets, you know that a guy that weighs 450 pounds doesn't fit into a casket easily at all. So that we have a resident in town here, I will not mention him, but he was associated with George Sullivan for the time. And they had to make a special arrangement for Travis's burial. And moving the body, I mean, this is 450 pounds dead weight.
Yeah.
So there's, if you know what I mean.
Take a lot of people to carry that.
You can never talk about services available in town without thinking of the Railway Express Company. The Railway Express Company at one time had a long building, storage building, right alongside the track, where if you wanted to have something brought by Railway Express, which was not Brown and it was not FedEx, and it was none of the modern services, FedEx was it. And the worst part about FedEx was, or about FedEx, I'm doing it now, about the Railway Express was that it was uncertain whether your stuff was going to get here on time. Finchbeck's used to send flowers to New York City, among other places, by Railway Express car, which stopped to pick up mail. And some of the boys in town remember the catch mail, which used to be hung up alongside the tracks. And as the train rolled by full speed, it had an arm that would reach out and grab the bag. Well, some of the residents, in fact, I think Gordy Whiteman did a poem on this, didn't he?
He did.
About the catch mail, which was a screw-up. It punched through the bag and scattered the mail all the way to Stony Creek. So there were certain delays in those days. And
I should think so.
mail was delivered differently than it is today. But that was one of the better tales.
I think Carl has a little bit to add.
Got one, too?
Well, actually, about Mr. Travers, he was really an awesome sight, and I don't mean that in any funny way. I mean, we were all in awe of him, and we used to see him every day. We played on the green, and he, as Stanley said, be driving around delivering people to different locations with his left foot out on the running board because half of them was out of the car. But when he did die, I remember he lived in a house behind the savings bank. They had to take the window frame out of the upstairs and get a crane and a flatbed truck and lower him down carefully. The undertaker was in charge, but they had to handmade a coffin, and also with a special top on it, and then it wouldn't fit in the hearse, so they had to use a flatbed even for the funeral. So his whole life was bigger than life. I mean, it was just, he was one of the characters. I do want to speak about some characters who moved to Guilford that were brand new to Guilford, and one of the most colorful couples to ever come here were the Harmons. They came in 1946, and I don't remember the first years they came because I was only 6 years old, but about the time I was 10 or 11, I ended up painting scenery for them and being a gopher. But they rented the building that's next to the library here, which at the time was a closed-up former Congregational church. Today it's the Christian Science Church. But at the time, Judge Durant owned it. Now, there was never a more colorful character in Guilford than Judge Durant. He was a judge of sorts. He had been a state legislator. He lived down where the Lobster Pound is now. His house was built, it was a cottage built on the body of an old schooner that had rotted there. And he owned the Beecher House, which was the first house up the street behind what is now the moorings. His wife lived in the Beecher House, and his other interests lived with him in the schooner house. But Judge Durant was one of the first Guilford people to go from West Palm Beach to Guilford every year. He kind of discovered Florida. But he owned this old building next door, and the Harmons came to Guilford in 1946, and with a little negotiations, rented the building from him and opened the Chapel Playhouse. This was summer theater, early summer theater. Guilford didn't take too kindly to the Harmons in the beginning. They couldn't find a house to rent for themselves and their young daughter and their maid. They couldn't find any homes in the beginning for the actors and actresses. They were all called players, and nobody in Guilford wanted to have players in their homes. But Judge Durant took him down to Monroe's Drugstore, the old Halleck Hotel, which is now above Cilantro's, and after taking 4 tons of debris out of the rooms upstairs and cleaning them up and painting them and patching the bedding and whatnot, they finally had a place for themselves and their players. And they opened the Chapel Playhouse, and the Chapel Playhouse is very colorful. It's a beautiful old building, lost its steeple earlier in history, had a lot of character, but it only had one to-let. When the Harmons first went in, there was this tiny 3-by-3 room to the right of the front door, and on the door was the words, "To let," and Mrs. Harmon asked Judge Durant, "What's that?" And her husband looked at her and said, "Come on." The eye fell out. And that was, then they had the dilemma of what to call it. Ladies and gentlemen's room or whatever. They finally painted on the door the French term for les dames and les hommes. I didn't do too well in French, but anyway. They were able to get chemical toilets for the back for the players, but that was the only John in the Guilford Playhouse. They had 100 1,000 funny stories of the famous actors and actresses who came here, things that happened to them. They finally, the players, got to live with people around town in the homes. Farley Granger came here, and of course all the girls went gaga, falling over themselves trying to follow Farley Granger around. But Tallulah Bankhead was here for a week, and unfortunately Tallulah had a drinking problem, and one show had to be done by the understudy because she couldn't make the opening call. But I got to paint scenery and run for Checkerberry sodas on my bicycle and whatnot across the green for them. But I never forget when Carol Bruce came. Carol Bruce was sort of a young, or an earlier Elizabeth Taylor. She was something else. I was only 11 years old. And when they did all the rehearsals and whatnot, they wore dungarees and dresses in those days. I guess the guys wore dungarees. But when they had the first matinee, and she came out on stage with her slip and just her bra and whatnot, I went running home, crying to my mother that this woman was on the stage at the Chapel Playhouse with nothing on but her slip and her undies. My father had to go out in the garage because he couldn't stop laughing. My mother tried to explain to me. Finally, my father said, "Don't worry about it. You'll get over it. In 3 years, you'll change your mind." The Harmons finally, after 3 years, exercised their option to buy the Chapel Playhouse from Judge Durant. He tried to avoid them until after the time period was over, because by that time they were making Broadway in a Barn really profitable and successful in Guilford. But they found him, they cornered him, they were able to close the deal for $11,000. And they ran the theater here for quite a few years, and we had a lot of great folks who came here, a lot of great shows. I've got some posters and some programs for you, but they also wrote a book, and if any of you are interested in reading it, the library has copies. It's called Broadway in a Barn. It's written by Mrs. Harmon. They later went to Clinton and then took over the Iverton Playhouse and had a long string of successes in this area and really brought theater and Broadway to Guilford and the shoreline. It was just a real colorful chapter in Guilford history.
Got anything to add to that? Thanks. Dan wants to.
Yeah,
Okay.
One of the things I remember best about that Chapel Playhouse period was my father was one of these volunteers who said, "Come on down." And we had a house down on the water. And these people, many of them had never seen water before. And one of my best memories was a man by the name of Edward Wing. Maybe some of you remember him. He was a leading man. He had a double thumb, like this. I can remember being fascinated. I mean, how does a guy have a double thumb? Well, today they'd take it off in a minute, I'm sure. But Carl mentioned one of my father's favorite characters, who was Harry Durant. And to give you some idea about what he was like in terms of his wit, I have a very brief little bit of doggerel from one of his books. It's called Christmas. It goes like this: "Oh, blessed day of give and take, give us a break, for Jesus' sake." That was Harry Durant.
We have some time for some questions. If anybody has a question for any of these people? Yes.
When did you find time to work?
I'll answer that.
We worked every single day. I asked my mother one time, "How come you never had more kids?" Because I wanted brothers. My parents' store was a mom and pop grocery store up on Route 1, and they started opening up till 9 o'clock on Fridays, and then they started opening up till 8 o'clock every night. And then they finally, the old Yankees said, "You got to open on Sundays because we need a place to buy bread and milk and get the papers," and those were the blue laws in those days, but we opened up. So we worked 7 days a week, but it was always an adventure.
Yeah, but play was work.
Work was
Oh,
fun,
yeah. I didn't know the difference.
Yes.
Where was the high school, the institute that you smelled so much?
The high school.
The original high school, the institute that you call it?
The institute was started way back in 1856 by Mrs. Griffin, and she and it was run as a high school until in the early 1900s. It became the Institute and Guilford High School. The High School Association joined with it.
So it's the same location where?
It's up on the corner of Route 1 and North Fair Street.
Oh.
Where they're building this nice condominium.
Oh, where the Shoreline Times ran?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
That Mrs. Griffin, is that the correct pronunciation? She gave $50,000 to build it, and she gave the site and the stone that they used to build the building was quarried right off of that site. So today, when you go up there to buy $1 million condominium in the building, you can see the stone ledge right there where they actually quarried the stone to build the original stone building. And we mentioned Mr. Mullen. Freddie Mullen. During World War II, Freddie was the keeper of the ration cards. And one night he was on duty there, and some fellows from out of town came in, and the ration cards were kept in the safe, but they beat Freddie Mullen up pretty bad because they wanted him to open the safe so they could steal the ration cards and make out with him. He would never give them the combination. He got beat up pretty bad that night. He never got a medal for it, but he was a great hero for Guilford.
They air spotted there too. They went air spotting there.
Oh, yeah, that's the other thing about the air spot.
Yes,
You talk about that.
it was during the war. There was an air spot station where people went to 2 hours at a time, all night, all day, to report any planes or something you might see.
Where was it?
Up in the cupola of the Institute building. That was one of the places.
About the tower on here,
Yeah, they also used the tower at Cranbrook there on the corner.
Traffic Island.
At Chapin
We're
Island.
looking for
And up on Long Hill.
Plane couldn't get by.
Cohen's place.
B-17.
When they cleaned out the Shoreline Times building and sold it, these two posters were found up in the attic, and these are actually posters that the air spotters had to train with. This was the silhouette for an American B-17 bomber. This is a silhouette for an ME-110 German bomber. And they had to learn the silhouettes of the planes because there really was the idea that Germany would send aircraft over here to bomb the East Coast. But these were actually used in the Shoreline Times building in those days to train the volunteer air spotters that worked there.
No, I wasn't a spotter.
For those who went through Air Force training, that was 1/500th of a second that you had for aircraft recognition. Japs and others. You either recognized them or you didn't.
Going back to the Institute building, I noticed in the paper just recently that they were hoping to name some section of it or part of it for the early owner. And if they gave it in the paper as Griffin, now if anybody goes looking for Mrs. Griffin or Griffin, they'll have hard luck.
One question?
We're located, our business, where the old Guilford Forge used to be, and it seems like if I ever talk to people from Guilford, they either worked there or know somebody who worked there or had something to do with it. And I don't know what part of history the old Guilford Forge was, because I was there for a long time.
Remember that one? Remember next door?
I worked there for a while. I don't know how old Lois was, but I worked in there
Speak right into it.
as a wait on people, and then I worked in the office once in a while too. So I don't know how old I was under Mrs. Richardson when I first went there, and then other people came in, and eventually it was sort of went bankrupt. So
Yeah,
that's all I-
where's Sarah McCullough? Is she
I
here?
worked there in the summer, and then sometimes I worked when I
was away in the summer, I worked there at Christmas time.
Sarah McCullough's book, is she here? She's got the whole history in that book. You don't have, if you don't have Sarah McCullough's book, you can get it at Page Hardware, I think. And Breakwater, too.
Yeah.
It's very handy, because it tells the history, the background, a lot of detail of what went on in this town as each house was built, and who built it. Very
I don't know how
useful
long it
thing
is.
if you're going to stay in town.
We have to stop. What, John, one quickie?
They must have some stories about the Martin brothers.
They do. We're gonna have to do this again. There are lots of stories.
Let me